Okay, I don't think Chen needs an introduction to this group, but I will still briefly introduce him. Chen is a colleague of ours here at BI and NSAC, and Chen is going to talk about the work that the division and the institute is doing on prioritizing vaccines. But he'd also talk a little bit about very recent results we have on understanding the interplay between the various changes that are happening in terms of vaccines and opening up of the society and the new variants. So with that, Chen, over to you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So the topic is efficient vaccination in a volatile pandemic. So first of all, I want to thank my collaborators. So this is a joint work with a lot of folks within the NSAC division, as well as Biocomplexity Institute, COVID-19 response team, and outside of the division and the institute. And this is supported by multiple funding sources. So my talk today consists of two parts. The first part is derived from a recent study that we still doing. And then the second part is derived from a recent manuscript that we wrote, and it was submitted to a journal and is still under review. So a little bit of background and the motivation. So we are facing challenges where the situation keeps changing as the pandemic progresses and the vaccines are administered. So one such change is related to the more infectious new variants. So in this plot, you can see that in Virginia, as well as in the whole US, the number of cases of the new variants keeps increasing, and actually it looks like not a linear increasing, but a superlinear increasing. So the numbers here is number of cases per 100K population. And actually for Virginia, it's actually below the whole USA level, but in general, you can see the trend. And then the second of such change is related to reduce the social distancing. So in this plot, which is derived from the Google mobility reports data. So this is just an example because this shows the mobility trend at retail and recreation locations in Virginia. And you can see it keeps increasing. That similar effect for other locations too, but I'm just showing this as an example. So because of this, we need a policy that is adaptive. And we need a vaccination with faster rate and better targets. So the approach we adopt here is using a detailed agent-based model to study the impact at the individual level as well as at the aggregate level. So many models can handle the aggregate level changes, but we need this detailed model in order to model and study the impact at the individual level. So we can identify a precise vaccination strategy. So we use this tool called EpiHyper. It's a framework where we built in-house, and it's a C++ based simulation platform that can model individual level disease progression as well as interventions at individual level and public health level. So we use this to run many studies for COVID-19 pandemic in the past year. And we run simulation experiments which are set up using the detailed and real data on the COVID-19 cases. So all this enabled by a detailed representation of a Virginia population and social contact network. We call that a digital twin of Virginia. In this slide, it shows briefly how a digital twin can be built using multiple data sources and then statistical models and so on, so that we have a representation that is statistically indistinguishable from a real population. And then we have people-to-people interactions generated, and then that can be used to simulate and model the epidemic, including influenza, including Ebola, including recent COVID-19 pandemic. So the approach is such that it maintains the anonymity and the privacy of individuals. But at some level, it's real. The individuals, they are not corresponds to every individual in the real world, but they are representative. I said that there are two parts of this talk. So the first part, ask and answer the following question: how fast should the vaccine administration be in order to catch up with the spread of more infectious new variants and the potential relaxation of non-pharmaceutical interventions? So this is derived from a recent study. So first of all, we try to show this figure of COVID-19 disease model used in our simulations. So you can see this is symmetric. The upper part is a set of base states, and then the bottom one is the same states, but they are assigned to vaccinated people. And then in this figure, we see there are 28 states, but actually it's age stratified. So we have 5 age groups: preschoolers, school age, adult, older adult, and the senior people. So those are 5 age groups multiplied by those. So actually in the simulation, we have like 140 health states and then many more transmissions and disease transitions in this model. This model was built based on the CDC document, earlier version of that. Simulation initialization that includes prior infections. So our approach is to take a recent snapshot and try to model the prior infections before that and try to seed the simulation using the data in the snapshot. So the prior infections, we look at the confirmed cases up to mid-February 2021, and then scale that to take into account the case ascertainment rate and also asymptomatic rate. So every confirmed case, we will think that in reality, there are 3 cases. And then seeding. So we do that using the confirmed cases between mid-February to early March. And we scale the confirmed cases in the same way. And both prior infections and the seeding, they are sampled at the county level. So we use the county level data, and also we use the age distribution data in order to see the nodes in the population according to that distribution. And then we calibrate the disease model. So there's a parameter in the disease model called the transmissibility that is tuned in order to match the effective value estimated from the recent data. So that was 0.9 in this setting. So the initial R effective is equal to that after the calibration, but then it's going to change during the simulation. So the non-pharmaceutical intervention mentioned on the previous page that includes 4 types. One is a universal reduction on the infectivity because people, they are practicing preventive behavior, mask wearing, hand washing, and other behavior. And the second one is generic social distancing. That means people, they change their activities, normal daily activities, and reduce their non-essential activities. The third one is because the K-12 schools, they have virtual learning, partially virtual learning. And then the last one is due to the symptomatic cases with some compliance, they will choose to stay at home for 14 days. And then at home, they reduce their home type contacts with their household members. So those are the symptomatic cases. The previous 3, they're not necessarily symptomatic. For those MPIs, they may decrease over time, either at the individual level because of people are tired of social distancing, or because people, they think that the vaccines would help, so they start adapt their behavior accordingly, or at the aggregate level, population level, because schools being reopened, kids are going back to in-person classes, workplaces starts to reopen, and so on. In the next few months, this is expected to happen. Some information about the vaccination. So we consider multiple vaccines based on the real data. So the vaccines consist of 2 types. One is the 2-dose type. So we have 400 million doses by Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna, and that's enough to vaccinate 200 million people in the USA, and it has a higher efficacy. The second is a more recent one by Johnson & Johnson. So that's 100 million doses to cover 100 million people. So it has a lower efficacy. So the vaccination, we consider two kinds of a schedule. They're hypotheticals. It's ongoing, and we are just trying to model two kinds of strategies here for demonstration. In one case, we consider that in Virginia, every week, 140K people are vaccinated. So it's a constant rate. So in reality, it's never constant, but we take the progress so far and then compute a constant rate and assume that that's the rate per week for the future. And then in the accelerated rate case, we consider that the weekly vaccination keeps increasing linearly. And then it ends up covering all the people who want to be vaccinated faster than the constant rate. In this question, we are trying to focus on the age-based prioritization. So that means we vaccinate senior people first, and then older adults next, and then adults. So remember that the vaccines are approved currently only for 18 years old and plus. Those age groups, they're ones that I mentioned before. The other two age groups are school age. That's people below 18 years old and also preschoolers. The uncertainties. So we consider a few dimensions of uncertainties. One of them being that the disease model was calibrated using R effective equal to 0.9, but we also consider that estimation itself has uncertainty. So we consider plus minus 10% of around that. And then the new variants, we consider over the months, it can either spread faster and become more and more dominant in the cases faster or slower. So in the slower case, we assume that it becomes completely dominant by the end of June. And in the faster case, that will happen by mid-May. The NPI relaxation in the study, we considered the compliance will keep decreasing gradually. But in the result that I show today, I'm going to ignore this factor and just focus on the constant NPI compliance across the simulation. As I said, this is an ongoing study, so more results will come out later. And then for vaccine hesitancy, so we consider that 70% of the people are willing to be vaccinated. In the other comparison case, we consider the 85% also. The vaccination administration speed, I mentioned this before, so we have two kinds of rates. One is constant, the other is accelerated. So after all those background information, now we can talk about the 12-cell experiment design, and it involves 4 factors. The first factor is used to build the uncertainty bounds on the results. And then the other 3, including the 3 levels of new variants spreading, and then 2 levels of vaccine hesitancy, and then 2 levels of vaccination rate. So the many simulations and the many results, I'm going to present a few of them here. So to highlight the insights. So first, we look at these 2 scenarios. This orange curve shows the daily confirmed cases if there's no new variants. And then it seems that the cases keeps decreasing with a constant vaccination rate. And then if we have a slow spread of the new variants, which is the green curve, then we see that at some point around April, the cases will start rising again slowly. So this means that the constant vaccination rate probably is not able to keep suppressing the cases. next we introduce this accelerated vaccination. And then that's the blue curve. So you can see that it seems to be able to mostly nullify the impact of the new variants. Although it's still above the orange curve, but most of the increase in the infections has been suppressed. And then we can see a fast spread. So in previous two plots, we had assumption of slower spread of new variants. But if the spread is fast, then again, the accelerated vaccination can help to cancel the impact of new variants, but only partially. So we can expect that with NPI relaxations, we need even faster vaccination in order to cancel the impact of both the new variants and the NPI relaxation. So the key takeaways include, first of all, the more infectious new variants will cause more cases, but the constant vaccination rate cannot keep the cases low. And if the new variants spread slowly, then accelerated vaccination with the current trend, it can mostly cancel the impact. If it spread too fast, then we need even faster vaccination.
Chen, maybe we can take questions if people have, because that way,
Maybe I have a question. This is Rajesh here.
Yeah.
So there was two options that you had for variants.
Yes.
But variants are also things that you could stem by maybe taking action to stop the transmission. So that sort of limits the variations to some extent if you're able to take immediate action. So is that something that would be worth studying? I know you have not done it, but is that something that is taken into account in studies of this sort?
You're saying some intervention measures in order to stop the spread? Is that?
Yes, because the number of variants is dependent on how much transmission you have. So if your control could take that into account and control the total number of variation itself, then it might lead to a different control problem with a different optimal solution. So I was just thinking aloud about that.
Right. And so actually, I think that's a good point. And I remember that recently we discussed this in the contact tracing context, where we say that if we can somehow, through tests and so on, have the data about which cases from which variants, and then we can probably be more focused on those cases from the more infectious variants and try to have them comply with the contact tracing and quarantine with a higher compliance, right? So some measures can be designed and taken in order to slow down the spread. That's right. Good point.
So Chen, maybe one quick question. Can you go back to the slide about how, because in terms of modeling this variant, the multiple choices, right? Like explicitly modeling the multiple strains or modeling the transmissibility and then co-infection between susceptibles. Was that something that, I mean, how do you consider those pieces, and maybe you can elaborate on the design choice for that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I get the question right, but my understanding is that the question is about how the spreading model in the simulation. Is that the
in terms of the variant, how do you explicitly, is it a multi-strain model?
Right. So there are multiple ways to do that. I actually talked to Malav this morning actually about this. So we have talked about the different ways. One of them is more intuitive, which will have different health states built into the disease model. And then the diagram that I showed earlier will become even larger. So the health state will take care of the different infectivity and different delta and different hospitalization ratio and so on. So those can be modeled appropriately in the disease model. But in this study, we took a more approximate and more coarse approach where we just simply increase the infectivity of all the cases and think that's an overall increased transmission risk in the population.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because in a course model, again, like people have studied this difference between like a double strain model versus a single strain model with a slowly increasing transmissibility. I was just wondering, like in the agent-based model, since we can explicitly characterize those disease states and even the cross, like someone getting reinfected by the new variant, and I think the interplay would be interesting to study, like how models differ in those two ways of design choices. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it can. Agent-based model is able to do this, and actually, we actually were planning to do this next. So,
yeah, in fact, like the question is, what is the benefit of a two-strain model? The answer might be different in a course model versus an agent-based model. So that's a different thing to answer.
Also, Srini, one quick point, and then Jeff also has a question that Chen should answer. But I think Rajesh's question nicely sort of dovetails into your question, because if you want to do a more targeted intervention that is strain-based, either vaccination, around people who, let's say if you see a township or an area which has got many more infections from a particular strain, or you want to do contact tracing and quarantining after that, then specific strain-based model will be absolutely necessary, I think so. If the overall understanding for now is just to understand whether this vaccine speed is going to help, this might suffice for all but that's a
here it's more of a competition of rates, but I thought like in the network model it was pretty much motivated by what Rajesh was asking now, because if you want to target interventions based on strain prevalence, then something like that would be helpful.
Right, and strain coevolution is also important. If the model we know has that ability, so one can decide what that has. Just yesterday I talked to Simon about how one could potentially represent the strain evolution itself, because that's a question in its own right, and one could study that in the future. Yeah, I think Jeff Townsend has a question as well in the chat if you want to answer.
Yeah. The question is about, in the long run, whether we will be able to vaccinate and revaccinate quickly enough. I think that needs to be studied a little bit. I don't have a quick answer here, but that's certainly the speed needs to be fast enough in order to work. Because we might have even, I don't know, maybe other new variants coming up in the future. So.
But Jeff, I think that if the point is, can we do it? I think we can. We just would need the right understanding of how we might get the second wave, or what, a fifth wave now, I don't know. But if it becomes endemic, what happens? Yeah. Once that happens, I think the model is capable of representing, but it's a very nice question and we can do it.
It would be really interesting to see the answer, yeah.
Then one other question. So this vaccine hesitancy is right now uniform in the population, so it's not clustered, right?
Right, it's not clustered. That's right. So our agent-based model has the capacity to handle all those, but it's not really modeled at the individual level or cluster level. So this is just saying that everyone has a probability of 70% of being willing to be vaccinated.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So I have a question. For factors 3 and 4, I'm confused about how do you have vaccine hesitancy as well as a 100% vaccination rate?
Yeah, that's a good point. So what I meant was faster vaccination was constant. So yeah, sorry, I copy paste this from somewhere else. So remember that previously I talked about constant rate and accelerated rate. So that's
okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It saturates at hesitancy levels.
It would be 100% if there would be no hesitancy. So 100% with 30% hesitancy would be evaluated. Actually, you cover only 70%, and that's for the other rates similarly.
Right. Okay, good. Thanks for the questions. But the second question asked, can we prioritize the vaccine allocation based on the structural property of the underlying network in order to optimize the reduction on the infections, hospitalization, deaths? So the network-based prioritization means that instead of age-based or occupation-based prioritizations, we look at the weighted degree of individual nodes and try to select those with high degrees and then vaccinate them. This heuristic seems to be true, but the study before were mostly based on mathematical results and on the highly structured random networks or simulation computational studies based on simple classes of social networks. So it's never tested in time-varying realistic social network. And then we're going to study this here. Some key findings up front. We see that this strategy can avert the infections, hospitalizations, and deaths significantly. And those are some numbers in Virginia, and those can be extrapolated to the whole USA to see the larger numbers. So these key findings, I just want to say that this part was derived from an existing manuscript. So we have a copy at the preprint server, MedArchive. So if you're interested, you can find more details there. Another thing is that the strategies, they are important when the NPIs are relaxed, and also at some locations, although this might not be true in USA or in Virginia, but in some other countries where the vaccines, they are coming in more slowly and maybe sometimes not even enough to cover the whole population, then this becomes very meaningful there. In this diagram, what we want to say is just that there are two approaches. So a traditional approach will take the demographic attributes like age and so on, and then just try to come up with allocation policies. But then because we have this content network, and I explain later how the structural measures can be estimated from reality, and then we can implement this degree-based allocation policy, and then that's going to be studied using epidemic simulation, which was initialized by all those ground truth data from case surveillance and other data sources. So the simulation initialization is similar as before. Instead, it's looking at a different snapshot, but otherwise it's very similar. And then in that earliest snapshot in from December to early January, the R effective was higher, so we fitted the disease model to a higher R effective value, 1.1. So this plot shows without vaccination, what are the cases, the number of cases. And then we can see that the slow relaxation of NPI has a higher number of cases, and then faster relaxation is even higher. So the vaccine parameters, we did this study earlier before the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was approved. So at that time, there were only 400 million doses. So we proportionally assigned this to Virginia, and then we came up with this schedule. So this is the constant vaccination rate. And then the efficacy, you had some different settings, but basically similar to the setting before for the higher efficacy vaccine. So the prioritizations, we consider a few different targets. A baseline target is no prioritization, and then targeting either essential worker or older people or people with larger number of contacts, which we call high degree people. That means the top quartile. We're not trying to rank individuals by degree. We're just trying to categorize them into quartiles, and top quartile versus the other quartiles. So that's a very rough categorization. And as well as people with larger total duration of contacts with other people. So that's what we call weighted degree. So that means an individual has contacts with multiple people and then with different durations, and then we sum up all those durations. That's the weighted degree. And then we also consider different degree of prioritization, either 100%, 80%, or 60% are given to the prioritized, and then the remaining they're given to those not in the prioritized group. That is to represent the fact that we might not be able to identify those people precisely. So there's some kind of approximation to that. So the experiment design, now we have 5 factors, 3 relaxation of MPIs, and then 3 vaccination schedules. So either there's no vaccination or the schedule is the full schedule as listed in that table you saw before. And then a slower schedule means only 50% of the vaccination can be done from that table. So 4 targets, and then 3 levels of allocation, and then 2 levels of vaccine efficacy. So the 50% efficacy that represents sometimes there's only 1 dose given. And then also consider there might be other new variants and so on. So that might make the efficacy lower. So those are, again, hypothetical scenarios. They do not project the real cases in the reality. So we will highlight a few results here. So one of them saying that the vaccination prioritization using the degree-based prioritization, it works significantly better than the age-based prioritization. And you can see that the cases being reduced or the deaths being reduced from the no vaccination case as well as between the 2 strategies. And then this result says that this degree-based scheme works for the normal 100% vaccination schedule as well as for a delayed 50% vaccination schedule. So those are the part of the prioritization targets. So we have much more than this, but we cannot fit them into one figure. But it clearly shows that the high degree based strategies on the top of both slides, they seems to be able to reduce much more infections than the other strategies. The next result says that this degree-based scheme, it works even when the degrees can be estimated only approximately. So the degree-based scheme is even more effective when the MPIs are relaxed. And what this means is that it can reduce even more cases, but proportionally that might not be more effective. But it basically means that if we have relaxed the non-pharmaceutical interventions, then the cases would be even higher. And then with the more efficient prioritization towards high degree people, the cases can be reduced much more. We also consider a lower efficacy vaccine scenario, and we can say it works for that too. So the figure shows the reduction on the cases and also the reduction on the deaths. So this little figure shows why the network-based approach works. So the vaccines will provide the direct protection as well as indirect protection. Direct means that if we vaccinate a node, then that node is less likely to be infected. And then indirect protection means that this individual being vaccinated or not is protected because the contacts around this person, part of them are vaccinated. So that's some kind of herd immunity notion here. So these 2 figures shows some structural measures changing over time when the transmission is going on. So from the simulation, we can extract network snapshots with more and more nodes. They are removed from the network because they are vaccinated or because they are infected and recovered. So we have a smaller and smaller residual network, and then we can compute, for example, the first eigenvalue or the maximal core from those network snapshots. And we can see that in a degree-based vaccination, the change in those measures are very different from the other strategies. In this first eigenvalue, you can see after the first vaccination, it quickly decreased the first eigenvalue, the high degree based strategy. How can we implement this in the reality? We can actually consider the digital contact tracing apps. Those apps can be used to estimate the number of infections, and then it does not need to be precise and does not need to reveal the real degree. It only needs to be able to use to categorize high degree people and lower degree people, and then just can be used to schedule vaccine administrations to those folks. So this study has some limitations. For example, the nodes that initially seeded, and also those prior infections, they were just based on county level data and age distribution data, and then we just randomly sample them. But it's not considering that those nodes, they do not have uniform distribution as the still susceptible nodes in the network. They might be already covering most of the high degree nodes already. So if that's the case, then the effectiveness of this high degree based prioritization would be reduced. And we also have some assumptions regarding the basic MPIs, and those are just some estimates. And also we assume that if vaccinated nodes are infected, this node can still transmit like any other node, but with a smaller probability, but it can still infect other nodes. And then a big limitation is all those assume some level of penetration of the digital app in the population. If that's very low, then it's very difficult to estimate the high degree people. But we had some computation in the paper which says that if the penetration is at a certain level, then it's good enough for us to approximately estimate and implement the degree-based approach. Thanks.
Thank you.
First vaccination. So that's a very good question. We're not trying to vaccinate all the people at the beginning of the simulation. So this is different from many previous studies. In this table, we had the monthly schedule. So every month we vaccinate 650K people in Virginia. And so the first vaccination, it means the first one. Any other questions?
There's Anil here. So one question on the earlier part. So the vaccine, you're assuming the vaccine efficacy is the same for all the variants, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a systematic way of thinking about how to adapt it or something? Is there data?
Yeah. So again, the model is capable enough to handle that. So for example, in this one, if we have from S or E, we can have extra outgoing edges to the other different symptomatic or asymptomatic states representing different variants. Then in the vaccinated copy here, and we can have corresponding, and then those will take care of what you were suggesting. But that's much more complicated disease model that needs to be built. We haven't built that. We took a approximate approach to scale everything down by the same, regardless of the variants. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks.
So I think there's been reports that some of the vaccines get wasted. So I think you said that, like, if you had 400 million vaccines, you could vaccinate 200 million. Mightn't it be a bit less because of wastage?
Right. Actually, to be honest, that's enough to vaccinate 200 million, which is about the same as the number of people who are willing to be vaccinated. So that's about like a 66% of the population. But the thing is that as the pandemic progresses, many people are already infected. So there's another dimension here. So meaning that in the administration, if we do not distinguish whether the person is already infected before or not, then then we are actually vaccinating them uniformly, then that's probably not as efficient as vaccinate those who are still susceptible. But again, the hesitancy is hypothetical. We say 70%, but it might not be 70%. So depending on that, the wastage or the shortage, either way, would it be different? So that can be modeled, but we need some concrete data to set the parameters. That's what I meant. But good point.
Bayon has a question in the chat.
Yeah. And how does degree correlate with occupation? So that's a very good point. When no one is vaccinated, so with occupation or age, the correlation with age is obvious, and we actually had previous papers, not on COVID-19, long ago, where we tried to correlate and proxy the high degree with a certain age group, and then that was done for the influenza, and then we actually had a pretty good approximation for that. And then for occupation, in reality, certainly, but in our current synthetic population model, where we do assign occupation to each individual, but that is not modeled precise enough to represent the precise degree distribution conditional on the occupation, although it has some correlation. So all those information can be made use of in order to identify high degree people. In the reality, if we do not have the digital device apps in order to do the estimation from that, then we can certainly use that. And that was actually the message that we sent before in all those previous studies. The next question is about, so at t equal to 1 when no one is vaccinated, or at the
question
later.
is basically looking at this correlation in time, like that's what he's asking.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have elevator work next to me, so there might be some noise. But the idea is, after you have done, let's say, the first phase where you have essential workers, older people, then can you use age groups or occupations, let's say by industry, or do you want to prioritize service industry workers because they are the ones that have a really high degree and they interact with many people throughout the day? Would that be a feasible way to implement this, or do we want to use other features in order to be able to go from the registry of people to getting the shots in the arms?
Right. In the reality, we know that certain people, like essential workers working at, for example, grocery store, they will certainly have a higher degree. So we don't, I mean, just by common sense, they would have higher degree. So we can just make use of that information. Yeah, so that's true. We should vaccinate them first, regardless of whether we are prioritize the essential workers or we are prioritizing the high degree people. So that's true. So it changed with NPI, and when NPI is in place and being relaxed, the degree keeps changing. But in this study, when we say high degree people, we talked about in some snapshot. And actually, we took the initial snapshot and just say those people, they are high degree. So there is some computational complexity to evaluate high degree people within the simulation when people are being vaccinated or when people are changing their behavior.
But I think to Stephen's point, Stephen, this would still, our strategy would be only improved if we compute the degrees dynamically. So in some ways, that's a lower bound is what I would think.
Yeah, my question was kind of related because there are two notions of adaptive. One is adapting to the disease state or NPIs, but even more than that, like I think the degree is computed independently for each node, and then you're sorting and taking the top K or something, right? So even if you do something greedily, or like, I mean, in the entire influence maximization literature, the more you look at it as this combinatorial problem of vaccinating K, you can get that 1 - 1 by E, or even better if you try to, instead of treating each of these individual decisions, the more assortative the network is, you might be able to spread it out more. And it might be an interesting thing to say, like, if you assume some structure of the synthetic contact network and you had complete control of who's immune at the beginning of the simulation, what is the minimum number that you need? It's almost like it ties very nicely to this herd immunity concept, but starting from time zero, like if you knew that 10% are immune, and if you can distribute that in some way, what is the best you can do in terms of minimizing the disease spread, like almost shattering the graph in an optimal way rather than just sorting the nodes. So that is a adaptive that does not involve disease state. It's just in the construction of that set itself.
Right. So I would say this is theoretically possible using our model, but it's going to have some computation challenge there. So, and also we had some assumption about if we look at the initial snapshot and the high degree people, then even if we have people being infected before they are vaccinated, and those people they probably tend to be higher degree people, still in the remaining nodes, if we try to vaccinate them targeting the high degree people that we chose according to the first snapshot, they are probably still high degree people in the residual network.
I think so, Srini and Stephen, one point I want to add to what Chen said. I think the implementability of the heuristic was the reason we chose it, because it seems that at least there is some chance of estimating somebody's degree up front. It will become a little bit harder as you go around. Of course, if you have the digital contact tracing app, then it certainly provides a good estimate of dynamic degrees. And
yeah, I was
then,
thinking more like from the implementable angle, it's more like not trying to cluster it too much. So for instance, if you're looking at Virginia as a whole, naturally there is a population bias, like the more people are in urban, higher degrees are likely to show up there. So there is a fairness angle, but also when you're using contact tracing, if you even ensure that they're sufficiently separated for degree or contact network geographically or otherwise, it might play out in a positive way as far as like this assortativity is concerned. Like 10 people vaccinated in the same house, you might actually spread it out across multiple households, and that kind of a thing might naturally play out.
right. So that I think, at least that particular example, we look at, we only put the degrees in quartiles. So it's fairly wide band, and then you pick things randomly. So if you do any sampling, then a small group of folks to get two people from the same group to be picked up becomes small. I mean, if you have a household of size 5, it's a low probability event that both will get picked at the same time, in the at least in the allocation scheme one has.
So that uncertainty in that kind of covers that.
Right, little bit, right. So that's why we kept the quartiles, because that captures many of these abilities to not able to estimate degrees correctly, not revealing the degrees right. It basically, I think our result, I'm speaking for all of us, you included, our results have a very simple thing. It just says, even if you can get a general bound on degree, it would really be a fairly good heuristic to implement, especially in places where vaccines are not adequate, not in places like Israel anymore, and even in US, maybe after a while, by May, this is not very meaningful. But just that is an important statement, I felt.
Right. So basically it says, so we only need to know who are high degree, who are low degree, and we don't need to know what exactly the degree is. So let's say that in the reality, the degree of some node is 100 versus 20, but we don't even need to know that. We only need to know that from the estimate, we might get like 10 versus 2, but that's good enough. We already know this node is high versus low. And then even that is not needed. As shown in this slide, we only need that to be 60% precise. We only need to be able to identify 60% with that accuracy, the high degree nodes. We can choose some nodes which we thought were high degree, but they were not. But as long as it's 60% precise, then it seems to be able to help a lot already.
I was just going to mention this. I don't know if this will go over very well, but let me just mention it as a comment. So this is really interesting. And in the heuristic as a potential decision strategy is an interesting suggestion to the people that make these decisions and are tasked to. They have, what we've seen in talking to them, and what's obvious if you reflect on it, is they have strangely other things to concern themselves with in these decisions than, strictly speaking, only the decrease in the spread of the disease, which is, it's hard to get your head around that necessarily, but they're concerned about the perception of other issues like various versions of equity of the plan. It could be because of ethnicity, it could be income, it could be location, it could be lots of things, but without demonstrated equity, you have other problems that have to do with things like not necessarily hesitancy, but other aspects of population response that you're trying to manage as a decision maker, and just other issues which we may write off as political, but which actually have material impact on the efficacy of the decisions and the outcome of the diseases. And this fits in that bigger picture in a really important way. And so what I'm suggesting maybe is something that this really interesting thing can serve, in that if we're really about supporting actual decision making, and that in decision making includes what I just outlined, that you can use this as a measure that whatever the distribution scheme they have is, can be evaluated in terms of how it's doing what is being talked about here. And it can be compared as a metric almost to, I don't know if we can call it optimal, but just for argument's sake, I'll call this an optimal scheme. And so you can actually cost these different considerations. You can explicitly deal with these balances, and you can, without being prescriptive in a way that says you should ignore those other issues, you can at least measure them in some sort of common way that might be extremely useful to decision making and help justify or otherwise underwrite the decisions they really do have to make. And I just think that that would be a really, really interesting thing to do in terms of both the practicality of the rollout of this kind of technology into real decision-making support, but also it could be a really interesting thing from the point of view of social measurement. And I really think it's a super interesting technique. I think that the idea of how it fits into the process of decision-making that's more complicated might be worth really looking at. I just wanted to.
So Chris, so it's a good point. And as you recall, in the previous work we have done some of it, this can serve as a proxy for an optimal allocation, in which case we can try adaptive variations as well, because it will give a stronger result. In this paper, maybe I'm just saying, and if you see whether you see it as not, and I think we can do it more generally, but we are saying age-based heuristics are the ones that people are using right now as this distribution scheme. And this tells you what its efficiency is in terms of overall reduction cases. So we have none, the degree, which is surrogate for optimum, let's say, and then age, which is the ongoing way of distributing it. And so your point is well taken. The gap between those two tells you what the efficiency of a method is. It's of course fairness and other issues. They have somehow potentially thought of it, and that's why they're proposing age-based heuristics, right? So is that you have in mind, or you have something?
You have to consider age for all kinds of, let's just call them social reasons instead of calling them political reasons. They're ethical reasons, say. You're very old, you're helpless. If society doesn't demonstrate a commitment to those who are helpless, it causes other kinds of issues in terms of authority that you can possibly expect to have, or things like that, things that decision makers have to consider. But suppose you run it the other direction. Suppose you look at the scheme that's the objective scheme that you're talking about now, degree, right? And you go in and you break it down by saying, this is what the ethnic priorities would look like if you did it purely this way by accident, right? Like if you did it this way, this is how it would affect ethnic prioritization. So if you have this, say it's a fairness issue, say you have this fraction of the population is this ethnicity or that ethnicity, and this is the rate at which they're being vaccinated under this scheme, and it is or is not above or below that fraction. This is one very primitive sort of kind of fairness issue that's raised commonly, you know, in the public space. And all I'm saying is that even though that seems like a very squishy thing for us to worry about, if we suggest that this is going to be used in actual decisions, it's not squishy at all for the decisions the people that use this do have to make. And if it fits into that kind of a setting, then explicitly figuring out ways in both directions, the one you mentioned, Madhav, in this backwards direction, right? The inverse direction might be very, very useful and make this technology and this approach and more introducible, more a part of, you know, it'd help us understand how this sort of stuff we've talked about endogenous decision making. Well, how does it really become endogenous? It has to include, if not exactly this, things like this, it seems to me. So like I said at the beginning, this may or may not be something that, you know, you want to talk about in this project, but I think it's really important for taking this technology to the point of decision making. And there's a lot of different ways it can go. So yes, I think your direction is a good direction. I think that's completely, though, it's not, it doesn't go far enough. I think it needs to go farther. Yeah. If you were going to go in that direction.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we've had such a good discussion today. I just want to thank Chen again for a great talk, and thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank
See
you,
you next
Chen.
time.